Hello and welcome to the Everything is Black and White podcast. I'm Andrew Musgrove, joined by Chief Newcastle United writer Lee Ryder. And in today's episode, we're going to talk about Eddie Howe being linked to the England job following the resignation of Gareth Southgate. And we're also going to talk about Darren Eales. Lee was one of the few journalists who got to sit down with Darren Eales yesterday to discuss all things Newcastle United. And as you might expect, it was quite a busy chat with Newcastle United Chief Executive Officer. There was talk about Eddie Howe. There was talk about Amanda Staveley and Mehrdad Ghodoussy's exit. There was talk about the other owners, or the only owners now, talk about Paul Mitchell and talk about the transfer market as well, amongst other subjects. Please hit like, subscribe, follow, give us a rating and review, and do head over to chroniclelive.co.uk as well to see a full range of that Darren Eales interview. Lee, welcome back to the podcast. How are you keeping?
Yeah, all good, thank you. Looking forward to the main bulk of pre-season and seeing what Newcastle can do in the remainder of the transfer market.
Yes, hopefully it's going to hot up just as the weather has started to as well. It's nice to see a little bit of sunshine. You're back from the Euro final. How was that?
Yeah, fantastic experience. I enjoyed the experience of it all. Seeing the England fans take over sort of Berlin was just incredible to see. It was a bit like when Newcastle played in Milan. They kind of took over the sort of riverbank area, and there was obviously flags everywhere, great atmosphere. Seemed to go okay in terms of like the crowd control and stuff like that. And obviously the result was disappointing in the end to lose the way they did, but I think as an experience it's one to remember. Just when the sun was setting in Berlin and all the England fans were like singing the Phil Foden song, it was a really good place to be. And at that point, when that song was going on for about 20 minutes, you felt that something was possible. The way England played in the first half, getting stuck in and limiting Spain. But after the break, obviously, it was a bit more difficult. Aside from Cole Palmer's equaliser, it was a tough night.
And we got the news yesterday that Gareth Southgate had resigned from his role. It was, not a massive surprise that was going to happen, as much as the FA seemed to want to keep him on. And now the news does, or the attention turns to who will replace him. Eddie Howe is thought to be among the candidates for that job, amongst some other high-profile managers, a few of them who are out of work, which you would think will maybe appeal more to the FA than having to pay to get Eddie Howe out of his contract at Newcastle United. But just starting on Eddie Howe and the links to England, if the FA come knocking, Lee, do you think Eddie Howe would want to have the conversation about potentially leaving Newcastle United and heading up to take the England job?
I think the big question is really, if there's an offer on the table, is he going to turn that down? Because you may never get that offer again. Your stock has to be at a certain level to be offered the England job anyway, and it's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. The FA could move on with different ideas. So this is a real tricky period for Newcastle, because he's obviously highly valued. There's a lot of top people tipping him for the job, saying he's the best choice, and he will probably feel that he's capable of working with an unbelievable group of players for England who are very close to potentially winning a trophy for the first time in many people's lifetimes. And yeah, I think it would be a really tough one for him to turn down.
It's interesting, because I've had this conversation with quite a few people about Eddie Howe in England, and I think he'd be absolutely fantastic for the England job. I do think one day he will be England manager, but from my point of view, I think it just comes too early for him, because he likes that inner workings of a football club, and you don't necessarily have that at international level. But as you say, he might never get another opportunity. If England do come knocking, he turns it down. Will that be it? We have to wait and see on that matter. But I guess when you look at the players, as you've mentioned there, Lee, that England have got, and you look at how Gareth Southgate, in the view of quite a lot of people, and myself included, didn't really get the best out of them. I know he got to 2 finals and he got to a semi-final of the World Cup, but in terms of the attacking talent he had. I just felt they always looked a little bit restricted. Do you think the FA look at how Eddie Howe has worked with the likes of Anthony Gordon and, you know, Alexander Isak, you know, the attacking talent at Newcastle United, and how he's turned them into a force, and they look and think, well, look, what could he do working with Anthony Gordon or Ollie Watkins or Jude Bellingham or Phil Foden? And that's maybe why they've put him on that list.
Yeah, I mean, as much as it pains any Newcastle fan to say it, Eddie Howe is the perfect candidate for the FA because he's somebody who's worked his way through the divisions in English football. He's someone who pulled on an England shirt for the under-21s, I think it was, earlier in his career. So, and he's obviously spoken about the England job before. He's been considered for the England job before. And yeah, I do see what you're saying about the day-to-day side of it, but if someone offers you the chance to pull on the England blazer, then I think that's a very hard one to turn down for any manager. And this is going to be interesting to see if he does it. And if he does get offered it and does turn it down, then will he forever be regretting that? Because come, you know, October, if things aren't going so well at Newcastle and he's under pressure, then he'll think I could have been sitting comfortably doing the UEFA Nations League with England here. But it's a very, very tough decision for him.
And we'll get on to kind of Newcastle United's viewpoint on it in a moment. But I do think the style of football he plays at Newcastle United will definitely have caught the attention of the FA. And in many ways, Lee, Eddie Howe is maybe a victim of his own success from a point of view of Newcastle United fans looking at it and thinking, no, please don't go, because he's been successful at Newcastle United since he's come into the job, taking them from potential relegation into the Champions League, into a cup final, nearly ending that trophy drought, and playing really, you know, attractive football, and, you know, that high pressing nature, you know, the energy of the team. Okay, it wasn't there throughout of all of last season, but there were reasons for that were a little bit out of his control. But, you know, as a whole, or for the large part, he's done very well at Newcastle and in a really attractive style. So that's why, you know, the FA wants him. And yeah, Newcastle United fans will be thinking, oh, goodness me, I hope he doesn't go. You spoke to Darren Eales yesterday. What did he have to say about Newcastle's viewpoint on England's interest in Eddie Howe?
I think basically the club viewpoint is they don't want him to go, but I suppose they're always going to say that, because if they leave the door open, then, and the FA do genuinely want to put an offer in, then the FA may think they can get a cheaper deal for him. But I think he had to say what he said yesterday, because he's got to show that he wants Eddie Howe to stay. He's got to support the manager, and what he said was pretty much what most people would expect your CEO to say, because you would want to be backed by your boss. So it's one of them where he is being given this opportunity now to hopefully continue what's going on at Newcastle. All change. You've got Paul Mitchell coming in. You've got James Bunce coming in. So it's going to be a different dynamic at Newcastle if he was to remain as head coach. And it'll be interesting to see how that works moving forward, because what we don't know is will a performance director and Paul Mitchell have any input into how the team plays? Because if they're going out to find the players, then they're going to have certain players already on their list who may or may not fit in with what Eddie Howe wants to do. So there's a lot that needs to gel at Newcastle. And he may look at it, if he gets offered it, as possibly it could be the right time for him to take it. We'll have to wait and see. He's said in the past that he likes the day-to-day involvement of it, but this is the England job, and the minute that someone puts that on the table, then I think everything changes. And he'll have people around him, his family, you know, they may want him to take it, because he may never get offered that chance again. Would he be offered the chance to be at Newcastle again? It's possible. Kevin Keegan came back a second time. So you have to wait and see. But ultimately, for him, this whole thing needs to be sorted, and it needs to be sorted pretty quickly, because Newcastle United have got an important season coming up, and they need to know who's going to be the head coach.
And obviously he's gone over to Germany with the squad. They're at the Adidas HQ, and he'll be speaking, no doubt, over the next few days, and he may well be asked about the interest of England. I mean, would you expect in that scenario, Lee, that he would come out and just shut the rumours down? And I suppose if he doesn't, that opens the whole situation. It takes it up to another level if he doesn't just shut it down the first time he's asked about it, I guess.
Well, he's already been quoted once saying "never say never" in 2022, and there's obviously the Gary Lineker interview many years ago where he said he would never say no to England. So has his mindset changed? I don't know. I think he's probably got to say something to pacify the Newcastle fans, really, because if he doesn't, then they're not going to be happy. So he probably, if he could avoid this press conference, I think he would prefer not to speak at all, really.
Yeah, because it's only going to be one topic on everyone's lips, isn't there?
He's going to get completely bombarded with England questions, and I think when was it? Was it March when they went away for a quiet trip to Dubai, and it was a closed trip, and it was perfect for the players and him to just get their heads down. And I'm sure that if he was given the option, he would have preferred to have that quiet week and just done the training, come back, and then face the press for the Hull City game. But it's going to be interesting.
That's what you have to deal with when you're in charge of a big club like Newcastle United. The quote from Darren Eales on Eddie Howe reads as, "It is speculation on Eddie. He has been an amazing manager at the club, and he is committed to Newcastle United with the work that he has done. We are obviously committed to him and had a multi-year extension signed last summer. We are on an exciting journey as far as we are concerned. Eddie is the man to lead us on that journey. From our perspective, there is nothing to add." And then, what comes out of that, as you said there, he's obviously backing him to stay at Newcastle United in many ways, as you say, Lee. He has to say that as Darren Eales. But what caught many people's attention is the fact that Eddie Howe signed a multi-year extension last summer. He'd already signed an extension or a new deal before that, but this new deal has seemingly gone under the radar, and Darren Eales has announced it there, which is good news for Newcastle United, because it does mean he's tied down to an even longer contract than many maybe thought he was.
Well, I think, to be fair, they've been very what's the word? They've been very sort of clever with the wording of that. He signed a new contract last year, because it was always my understanding that when he signed the deal that Dan Ashworth gave him in 2022, that deal could run on for like 7 years or something like that. So I think what's happened is that there could be a rolling element to this. Things could have been triggered within it, and they just didn't feel the need to come out and announce it last summer, because ultimately everyone knows he's on a long-term deal. Everyone knows the deal's 6 or 7 years, which has never been confirmed 100%, but that's what most journalists' understanding of it is that it's a long time. So I think it was interesting the way that was dropped in, and I think that could have only been for the FA's benefit.
Yeah, I mean, can you see the FA paying to get Eddie Howe out of their contract? I mean, it's one thing to say he's at the top of the list and we want him and he's our first choice, and we don't know that is the case. We know he's probably on the shortlist, but it's another thing to actually spend money on getting him out of his contract. And we were having this conversation yesterday in the office, and to my mind, I can't think of a manager the FA have paid for to get out of their contract. Maybe someone said Sam Allardyce at Sunderland, but I'm not too sure whether he left on a free to go to England. I mean, I don't know exactly, but can you see the FA paying to get Eddie Howe into the job?
Yeah, because I don't think I think it's a drop in the ocean to the Football Association to pay that compensation figure, especially if it's the man they want. So I don't see that being a problem. I think What the FA need to be careful of here is making an underwhelming appointment. Now, I've seen something in one of the newspapers this morning about Pep Guardiola coming in at the end of the next season with Lee Carsley being sort of caretaker manager in between. I mean, that as good as a coach Lee Carsley is with under 21s, that is not going to sell you tickets for UEFA Nations League games at Wembley. Having someone like Eddie Howe would, because I think he's respected not only in Newcastle, he's respected all around the country, and I think that's why he'll be seen as a good fit for England by not just the FA but the supporters. The only people it's not a good fit for is probably Newcastle. But again, I have to try and temper in that there's a new dynamic in the boardroom, and we know that Paul Mitchell has worked with Pochettino before, and they're going to have their own ideas. So it's going to be really interesting to see how this all gels. But I think for the supporters' sake, we just need a decision, and one pretty quickly. The FA should probably be respectful to Newcastle as well by giving them, a decision either way as quickly as possible, really. But as I say, Eddie Howe for me would probably be from England's point of view. You go around and ask most England fans, he would be probably the people's choice to get the England job.
And he probably would do, and that's unfortunate for Newcastle United. The other bit of that quote from Darren Eales that stood out was, "We are on an exciting journey, and as far as we are concerned, Eddie is the man to lead us on that journey," which again reaffirms their commitment to Eddie Howe. I mean, I read that, and they really do want to keep him. But if Eddie Howe wants to go and the FA pay the compensation, do Newcastle have a contingency plan in place, Lee?
Well, it was mentioned yesterday that they do, and any club worth a salt will want to have someone in mind who could possibly come in straight afterwards. I've mentioned Pochettino there, someone who Paul Mitchell's he's worked with before, and I think without jumping the gun, we're just having a discussion about football here. Hypothetically, we can talk hypothetically. If Eddie Howe takes the England job, Pochettino would be, I think, a good choice for Newcastle. I think the style of play that he's got, his pedigree in terms of challenging for honours, and I think his style of play, I think, would be a good fit for Newcastle. But that's jumping ahead. As I say, we're just talking about football here. We're just doing what anyone else is in the pub or the social club at the minute. We're having a chat about football, and the hope is that it gets resolved quickly. Eddie Howe's allowed to continue, and we push on towards next season. But it feels like the saga might have a bit more distance to run.
One saga after another. Just when we thought we were done with sagas and Dan Ashworth had gone to Manchester United, then we get this Eddie Howe and England saga coming to the surface. I found the quote here from Eales, and he said, it's something when you're organised, you've got to be thinking about. But the chief stressed that he expected Howe to be in charge at the start of next season. And when you spoke to Eales, Lee, and when you were hearing him answer the questions on Howe, did you get the feeling there was a nervousness within the Newcastle United camp about the future of Eddie Howe, or were they quite relaxed about it?
What, were Newcastle relaxed about Eddie Howe?
Yeah.
I think it's been a tough summer at Newcastle. I'm not gonna try and paint a picture that everything's been calm at Newcastle, because it hasn't. They sold players that Eddie Howe didn't want to sell. Elliot Anderson wasn't a player that Eddie Howe would have wanted to get rid of. Minter going to Brighton was a player that we need a winger. He's just had a great season with Feyenoord, and then he sold without kicking a ball. So that was messy. You had the Dan Ashworth thing that dragged on and on and on. You had Amanda Staveley leaving. and you had two new sort of figureheads coming in. So it's been a disruptive summer for Newcastle, and they need calm now. And at the minute, looking under the horizon at the minute, it doesn't feel like it is calm, because until this England thing's sorted, it's going to be, there's going to be question marks.
But you do get the sense that, if this had happened under previous owners, there might have been a little bit of a sense of panic. But under this ownership, and I know some might say, well, actually, if you look at the way that the PSR situation was dealt with, that was panic. But with Eddie Howe here, it does seem, as we said, there's a contingency plan in place. They do seem calm about whichever conclusion this goes to, whether it is Eddie Howe leaving and they have to replace him, or whether he stops, he gets the backing and he gets to build on what he's done over the last few years.
Well, yeah, I think, look, last season it didn't go how anybody planned. It didn't go how Eddie Howe planned it. There was a lot of problems with injuries. There was clearly things that needed to be resolved behind the scenes, and they did try and rejig the physio department a little bit. And the second half of the season was, if we're being honest, it wasn't spectacular. They finished 7th, missed out on Europe. Obviously got knocked out of one cup on penalties. Got knocked out of the other cup by Manchester City. There wasn't a lot to cheer about, really. And at one point in March, Newcastle had slumped down to 10th place. And it was only a partial recovery that nearly got them into Europe through the back door. So I think that there's a lot of room for improvement no matter what happens. And people will be probably listening to this and thinking he's probably being a bit negative there, but I think I'm just being realistic. Newcastle have got a lot to prove going into next season, because I wrote a piece the other day saying it feels like the Premier League now is a top 7 or a top 8. It's not a top 4 anymore. It's going to be difficult just to get in the Europa Conference League again. Now Newcastle have got a run at the domestic competitions with no European football. Hopefully that's going to benefit them, but there's no guarantees. Look at Manchester United's league position last season. They finished 8th, managed to win the FA Cup, which saved them and compounded our misery. So it's going to be a competitive season, and I think Newcastle need to push on and make a couple of really convincing signings now.
Yeah, 100%. It feels like a massive season for Eddie Howe and Newcastle United, given they haven't got European football this season. They most certainly will need European football next season. And I think the expectation from some, Lee, is at least qualification into the Europa League, if not the top 4. So it definitely feels like a big season to come. You mentioned Paul Mitchell. He's come in, he's replaced Dan Ashworth. James Bunce has then been appointed, and they work together at Monaco, got a really good working relationship. And that's raised questions about what that means for Eddie Howe. You've already briefly spoken about it just earlier in the show there. Plenty of people think it means more scrutiny on how, some think it might mean maybe a little bit of control being wrestled from Howe's grip. Did Darren Eales shed any light on how he sees the three of them working together?
Well, he spoke about it as 2 positive incoming figures, and Newcastle desperately needed someone who's committed. And it looks like Paul Mitchell is going to be a completely different sort of sport director compared to Dan Ashworth. Dan Ashworth basically come in and, without being disrespectful, he didn't do anything. He left everything the same, pretty much. He did a good job at keeping things calm, but then the minute Newcastle had money to spend, we had the Sandro Tonali situation. So really, Dan Ashworth didn't do a good job at Newcastle and then left for Manchester United. So if he'd stayed and turned it around and brought in a couple more signings to get over the Tonali thing, then maybe it would be a good move. Now, Paul Mitchell seems more hands-on. Seems like he's going to have an input on more than just signings. And he's going to, almost be aggressive, really, and try and get Newcastle where they should be. He's up for the challenge. He looks up for it. He looks focused. And I listened to, I think it was an older interview from James about, I think it was talking about having to have a rapport with the manager where it's a bit like a marriage. I think you've seen that one as well.
Yeah.
And almost saying, you know, if things go wrong, then he's not going to be the guy that's going to be going. And if that's still the sort of approach, then I think it gives everyone around the club suddenly has this massive shake-up, and it's going to be a really interesting season to see how Newcastle respond on the pitch. Eddie Howe needs a good start. He's got that opportunity. He's got 3 good games to start off with. Probably needs 6 or 7 points from the first 3 games. And then I think they move into the first international break, probably in a good place. Hopefully they can get through in the cup as well. But, you know, it's suddenly it looks like Newcastle do mean business again.
It's a good structure to have in place. In the interview Lee's referring to there, I think the quote was something along the lines of, it's like a marriage, so I'm not going to be your best friend all the time, and I might have to be a little bit harsh, but it's because I love you and I want this to work. So he was kind of showing how his relationship with the manager would work, that he's not always going to be telling them, he's not going to be a yes man, essentially, was the bottom line of it. Darren Eales added on Mitchell that he's been brought in to channel Eddie onto what he does onto the pitch. So, you know, he's not kind of going to maybe overrule him on things like some people suggest he might be. Hopefully all 3 of them can have a really good working relationship, because if it works, Lee, you know, Newcastle United are going to be going places. If James Bunce his role can find the added advantage in whatever, you know, or everything, you know, what they're eating, the way they travel, you know, what they do in the morning, you know, if they take an extra length in the pool sort of thing. If you can find every little advantage and put that into the squad, and Mitchell can have an input in that and bring in the players that Eddie Howe can work with, there's a recipe there that can really make this exciting and successful.
Well, that's exactly it. And I think, to be honest, again, if we're dealing in sort of a realistic world, everything wasn't rosy in the garden last season for Newcastle. It wasn't, and we know that because they lost a lot of games that they shouldn't have, and they had a lot of injuries, and players came back too early. It was a bit, you know, chaotic at times, and I think you had towards the end of last season, I think the fan base weren't getting on Eddie Howe's back or anything like that at games or nothing like that. There was no animosity. But I think when you're looking on social media, or when you're talking about people having a chat in the pub, which is what happens up here, it's fair for me to say that not everyone was happy with how it was going. So that's why they need a good start, because at the minute you've got supporters who are just so grateful to have come out of the Mike Ashley era after 14 years of, you know, whatever that horrible chapter was. And they're like, they've got this sort of attitude where it's like, well, I've got my club back now. I've got my life back now. Let's not moan. Let's get behind the manager. I'm all behind that. But also, people are going to scrutinise performances. And there were some games last season where, I mean, the Champions League exit, for a start, the game management wasn't right against AC Milan, because if Newcastle had held on for the draw, they'd still been in Europe anyway. If they'd held on the 1-0 win, they were going in the next phase. But they didn't. They got beat 2-1, and obviously everything started to go wrong from that point onwards, and it wasn't the same atmosphere after that night. In a way, it was always like that cloud was over Newcastle a little bit. So there's lots of positives, you know, Adidas coming back, couple of new signings through the door, but by the same token, there's still a lot of work to be done.
And I agree with you about what you say about last season and lessons needing to be learned. And it's about, you know, not always looking back and being, you know, I think what people often say is, I remember where we were when Howe took over. You know, we were in the relegation zone looking destined for the championship. Even at the turn of the year, things were looking really, really bad. Remember where we were is always the line people tend to sprout. we've come on from there. You know, we are 3 years from then, and now we have to really be looking up and pushing the club in terms of getting that success, and that's what Mitchell and Bunce will bring. We've spoken about Eddie Howe in the England job, Lee, and how maybe one of the reasons he won't go for it is that day-to-day working and that control and detail that you have in a club job. But some do think Mitchell and Bunce coming in maybe takes a little bit of that away from Eddie Howe. How do you think Eddie Howe looks upon these two appointments? Do you think he will embrace the change? Would you think he'll look forward to working with them and look at it in a positive light?
Well, hopefully, if Newcastle do well next season, then it'll be a collective success, because some people might credit the manager, some people might credit the backroom staff, the sporting director. We'll have to wait and see. But I think every manager needs support, but everyone's got to be reading off the same page. And I know Eddie before has spoken about needing to have a final say on transfers almost. I don't know if that's going to be the case with this one. Is there a discussion on how a player is agreed on? There's lots of work gone in by the scouting team before Paul Mitchell come, but he'll now have his own ideas as well, so, and his own contacts. So it's going to be interesting, and I think there could be a couple of little surprises thrown in there as well.
Well, on the transfer window, Lee, I think a lot of people have been a little bit underwhelmed by what's happened so far. You know, 2 goalkeepers have come in, Lloyd Kelly, which I think is a fantastic signing, but again, not a sign that I don't think sets the imagination alight of many people, which I think does him a disservice, because I think he's got the potential to be one of the best free transfers this club's probably ever signed. What did Darren Eales have to say about the transfer market and where Newcastle United are in terms of what they can do this summer and what to expect?
Yeah, well, basically he was always going to be a player, a CEO that was going to say, sorry, my phone's going off here.
It's Darren Eales, he's listening.
Yeah, but no. No, it's one of them where he was always going to have that kind of positivity, saying that there's money to spend. The PSR rules have reset, and the cycle has moved on. So thankfully now Newcastle can spend some money, which they couldn't do in January, and they had to obviously, lose a couple of players in June. But now we're on the other side of that now, and hopefully they can spend something close to, I don't know, 100 million maybe, bring in a couple of quality players and see where they go from there.
And do we expect things to step up in the transfer market soon? Because I think a lot of people would have expected at least one signing to come before they headed to Germany. Fingers crossed it'll happen before they head out to Japan. Is there any suggestion that we could see things starting to move in the next week or two?
Well, I think things have always been going on in the background. I'm pretty confident that they are going to be close to making a signing, whether it's before Japan. No one knows in terms of negotiations, player agents demanding fees, clubs adding things on. And that's why you've got someone like Paul Mitchell to come in and trying to get a deal done quickly. But I think you've got to get your homework right, because the Tonali situation wasn't a good situation last year, because they signed a player who, yes, we know he's quality, but he obviously had a problem, and £55 million was spent, and that player couldn't be used for 10 months. So it's about getting the homework right, and I'm pretty sure that I hope that was a one-off.
Well, fingers crossed, because Newcastle United certainly were a worse team without him. I think there's so much excitement about him returning, and we can't wait to see him in the black and white of Newcastle United. At the same time, obviously last week we had to confirm that Mana Stavely and Dad Gadusi were going. We did an episode on it. Darren Eales was asked about that. He said it was a kind of a mutual agreement. He was also asked about the commitment of the Public Investment Fund and the Rubens. And he said, in terms of profile and interest, it's one of their highest things on their portfolio, that being Newcastle United. But in terms of obviously their investment, it's not. But in terms of their profile and interest, it certainly is. He also said they were fully committed and they're excited for the future, which is all music to the ears of Newcastle United fans.
Yeah, I mean, it is time to sort of turn the page. I think, as I said last week, Amanda Staveley did a very good job at Newcastle, but things have the page has turned, and it's turned pretty quickly. And I think now it's a case of looking forward, not backwards. Hopefully, the new signings will roll in and get this team settled down again, and then trying to get back into that top four. It's got to be the top four next season. You know, Europa League would be nice, but I think if Newcastle want to show the mean business, then they've got to at least aim for the top four. So,
yeah, see. Most certainly so. I mean, but when you hear Eales say that, and again, you know, some will argue, well, he's not exactly going to say that they're not committed. But I guess the fact that, you know, they're going to buy up the rest of that stake. I mean, the Rubens obviously already had taken a little bit of Staveley Gudusi's percentage, and it looks like the public investment fund are now going to take the rest of it, or at least some of it. That's just good news. It just reaffirms what we already knew, that, you know, both of Newcastle United's now co-owners, you know, the Rubens, the third richest family in the United Kingdom, the public investment fund, one of the richest, you know, investment funds in the world, are here to stay, and they mean business when it comes to Newcastle United.
Yeah, I think we were always going to be in good hands. There's no doubt about that in terms of, you know, financial backing. The problem is that the rule book means you can't spend in one big lump, and you've got to do it by the book, or you get hit by points deductions. So I think there was always that willingness there, but I think Newcastle have. It's hard to say they've done well to avoid getting a points deduction, because that was a little bit too close for comfort for me. Having to do it like right on the last day, and sell players that A, Eddie Howe didn't want to sell, and B, they didn't want to go either. They didn't want to be sold. So it's that chapter's behind them now, hopefully, and they can now move ahead and hope that they can start gelling on the pitch.
And Eales just there was one final quote that Eales put out, and he said, "I've spoken about the end of the cycle with PSR, and this is a big year for us now going forward, and we go on that journey to become a club competing for trophies and being in Europe every season. That's got to be our aim going forward." And again, it's just words, and until it's achieved, that's all it is. And that can be achieved, you know, through the signings. It can be achieved obviously through winning things or getting back in the top four. But from a Newcastle United fan's point of view, after, as you say, and I agree with you, a rather disappointing season last season, to hear those words from the CEO again just excites you for what's to come. You know, his aim, the club's aim, is to be competing for trophies and being in Europe every season. That can only excite a Newcastle United fan.
Well, yeah, I mean, he said the right thing, because in the past we've actually had a mission statement that said that they want to just finish in the top 10, avoid relegation, and play the youngsters in the domestic cups. So there was zero ambition before that. So it's nice to hear that ambition, but anyone can say it. You've got to go out and do it, and that's what Newcastle have to do next season. And I hope that they get off to a flying start. You know, they've got my backing, but they've got to really pick up from where they were last season, because there was some disappointing games, even in that run-in towards the end. Brighton at home, Everton at home,
yeah,
Man United away. Where you would never get a better chance to beat Manchester United at Old Trafford in the Premier League, and it wasn't taken, and it ended very disappointingly, really. And the agony was prolonged until the FA Cup final, because then we had to wait to see who won the cup. And then, typical, when you think Man City are going to sweep everyone off the park, they end up getting beat. So it's not great, but hopefully next season can be a lot better.
Fingers crossed. And I just want to finish, Lee, by reading a few of our comments that we've got from our listeners. I asked for them to send them in just before we started recording. And David says, so I asked them their view on the Darren Eales interviews, the interview you sat in, and the interview with the club as well. And this is the response from some of our listeners and viewers. David says, more words, time to start seeing actions. We need to strengthen, and soon our rivals are all getting stronger. Capital G says this is a well overdue update, but it is in response to a poor summer to date. Eric says, biggest takeaway for me is that the PIF is still on board and fully backing the project. Krista says, since Staveley is gone, the club needs a new face. I think he is the perfect guy to take on that role. I like him a lot. So Krista giving Darren Eales the thumbs up there. And Rob says, it was what we needed to hear after that PSR nonsense and Ashworth exit. Solid answers, addressed most things fans wanted to hear, and just at the right time. He helped reset the mood and provide a more positive outlook for the season. And I think that's probably the point to finish on, Lee. Has it reset the mood, you think? And it allows people to breathe that little bit easier. And now we just wait for hopefully a couple of additions in the not too distant future. Pre-season can begin, the friendlies can begin, and people go into the end of this pre-season a little bit more happy and confident about the new season to come.
Yeah, well, it's good to communicate. It's good to, there wasn't any restrictions. Nobody was told what they could and couldn't ask. There was nothing off limits. So, and it wasn't just one journalist, it was a number of journalists. So he was asked all the difficult questions, if you like. I asked him if they are going to keep people like Anthony Gordon and Isak and Bruno, do they now have to show them that they're ambitious as well? Because ultimately, if you're just going to sit on your hands and not sign anyone and just hope that next season's going to be better, it won't be. And other players, the top players, will start looking elsewhere. They'll be, all three of those players, while they're committed, we hope they're committed, they'll be devastated they're not in the Champions League, especially Anthony Gordon, after what's happened in the last 12 months, his rise to prominence. Bruno was talking about getting into Europa Conference League, and he hasn't even got that. And Isak has probably been the least vocal on talk about his future, and he's basically just said that he wants to stay at Newcastle. But again, it's like Eddie Howe. If there's an offer comes in, you don't know for sure. If an absolutely ridiculous offer coming for him from a big club, and we should be a big club as well, but a club that's got ambitions, got the Champions League, and are ready to win a trophy, then his agent will be telling him to think about it.
Do you think them ambition signings on too long away? I mean, obviously the position on the right wing is seemingly the priority, and plenty of names have been linked, and it's always created a little bit of debate who would come in and, let's be honest, replace Miguel Almiron. Michael Elise was the first name that they went after, and me and you both said what a fantastic sign that would be. And it seems like every name that's come since, Lee, for some, because they went after Elise, who had such a good season, is now going to have to join Bayern Munich, is a little bit underwhelming, which I think is a little bit disrespectful to the likes of Anthony Elanga or Brian Mbeumo. Where do you see that search for a winger going?
Well, look, you've got to look at the top four, and whoever comes in has got to be as good quality-wise as what the top four have got. Because if you don't match the quality in the top four, then you've got no chance anyway. There's no time for experimenting next season. It's got to be players who are ready to hit the ground running. And yeah, the players you mentioned there are Premier League proven players, but are they Champions League proven players? That's the question you've got to ask. Newcastle need that, but it's hard to attract those players because there's no European football on offer, and it's very difficult. So yeah, it's going to be interesting, but they've still got plenty of time left. What is it? Another month or so another 6 weeks. So we've got 6 weeks to get this squad up to speed. So let's give them the time to perform, and then judge at the end of the window.
Yeah, Paul Mitchell needs to get his feet on the desk first, and I'm sure he's got his list to work off alongside Steve, Nixon, Lee. Thank you very much for popping on to the podcast, you guys watching and listening. Thank you, as always. Do head over to chroniclelive.co.uk for all the latest Newcastle United news. Thank you very much for joining us, and for myself and Lee, we'll see you guys next week.